Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. For all of its many issues, there's no denying that Gran Turismo 7 is easily the most feature-rich game in the series. As well as the main single-player career that's been in almost every GT game, you can also find the livery editor, scapes, sport mode, and even more features that you could easily sink hundreds of hours into if you're so inclined. Really, comparing the series in current day to the original game from 1997 shows just how far things have come since then. But that only tells us one side of the story, because over the past 27 years and 8 mainline titles, there has actually been a surprising amount of features that have appeared and then been left out of subsequent games. Today, I'm going to talk about a handful of the most noteworthy features that are still yet to return to this series. We'll first go over how they appeared in the previous games, their positives and negatives, and then discuss whether or not they should even come back. And in the cases where I think they should, I'll give my opinion on how I would implement them if I had to make the decisions. A lot of the features in this video are ones that many people will have fond memories of from the older games, but were they really as good as we remember? And do they even make sense to have in current Gran Turismo? Well, let's find out. We're starting off with a feature that was first introduced in Gran Turismo 4. Now, GT4 brought us a few new game mechanics, like refueling, mission events, and coffee breaks. Not really sure if that's a good thing though. But the mode that I would like to highlight here is photo travel. Yes, it's not the most exciting feature, but along with the ability to take photos from race replays, it did debut in GT4. This mode allows you to take your car to several locations across Japan, the US, and Italy, 15 in total. They honestly did a really good job with modeling these places. The photos you can take still look good even today. Considering that, I guess it makes sense why these locations take center stage in the intro to the game. Moving on to Gran Turismo 5, photo travel would return. An all-new selection of 12 locations was included, albeit one is just an additional winter theme for Arvila Town Square. They also later added a unique NASCAR pit stop location at Indianapolis, which is a pretty neat idea and bumps the total up to 13. An interesting point is that whilst every location is unlocked from the start in GT4, in GT5 you have to earn some of them. Most of these can be found in the Grand Tour special events, where you unlock 4 locations simply by clearing each stage. The locations are also seen in the small cutscenes that play in between each event, showing your driver change cars, which is a pretty cool way to use them. 3 of the Arvila locations are also unlocked from completing the AMG Driving Academy special events at Bronze, Silver, and Gold grades. Rather randomly, you can also unlock the Kyoto Shorin-in location from the Japanese Classic event in the Beginner League, meaning that there are only 5 locations available from the start of the game, with the other 8 being given as rewards. GT5 of course carried over some 800 PS2 quality car models from GT4 and GT PSP, known as standard cars, and sadly none of them are allowed into photo travel. I assume that this was done to avoid them clashing with the much higher quality of the locations, not as if that happens in the rest of the game anyway. But moving over to GT6, photo travel would once again return. The good news is that standard cars would finally be allowed in, and you can even place a second car as well. The bad news is with the locations themselves. There are just 5, and 4 if you discount the nighttime version of Syracuse. There is also a noticeable lack of variety, with the only locations being in Spain and Italy. I've always found it quite strange how they didn't carry over the photo travel locations from GT5 as well. I mean, they did with the cars and tracks, but not these. Weird. Anyway, it would turn out that GT6 would be the final send-off for photo travel as we knew it. The mode did not return in GT Sports, effectively being replaced with scapes. So there are some trends we can notice with how photo travel was used across these 3 games. Naturally, as time went on, it became easier to use and had higher fidelity locations. But personally, I think GT4's photo mode was the best, simply thanks to its selection of locations. I feel like it had easily the best variety of the 3 games. You could go from the Grand Canyon, to a snowy mountain road, and then to a densely packed city. Whilst the locations in GT5 and 6 weren't bad, I just feel like they didn't cover anywhere near as much ground. Of course, this isn't an issue now in GT7 with Scapes, where there's well over 1,000 locations to choose from. The difference is that whilst photo travel used 3D modelled environments, just like the tracks, Scapes are created using a 2D photo with simulated 3D mapping and lighting, allowing the car models to be placed into them near seamlessly. This process allows them to be created far quicker and also look more realistic, because they are, well, real. So on the surface, this may seem pretty pointless. Scapes are just photo travel locations, but better in every way. So what argument is there for them returning? Well, there is one crucial difference. As the photo travel locations are 3D models, you can move around them freely. This grants you much more freedom in terms of the angles you can achieve, and also when it comes to exploring these areas. It's certainly a lot more interesting than just looking at a flat picture. This is why you could make the argument that photo travel should return, as it was able to offer something that Scapes never will. But realistically, doing so would kind of undercut the purpose of Scapes, so I don't think Polyphony will ever do it. However, although photo travel isn't in GT7, photo travel-esque locations are seen in the game. They're mostly used as backgrounds for the menu book cinematics, such as this one, which they introduce as the location of Brand Central, but then never actually use it as Brand Central. But what's most fascinating is that they do also reuse a couple of the photo travel locations from GT5 and 6. So, although you can't really make a great argument for photo travel replacing Scapes, I definitely think that these photo travel style 3D locations can be used in other areas of the game. I mean, we saw the example of Brand Central as a 3D environment, so imagine how cool it would be for this to be the actual dealership that you can explore and interact with, rather than just a flat menu. It would give off some major Test Drive Unlimited vibes, that's for sure. Of course, for those of you lucky enough to have PSVR 2, you can already experience something like this in the VR showroom, which features pretty much all of these 3D locations. For now, it is just a novelty, but who's to say that it won't have a bigger part to play in the future of the series? Whilst a game mode that allows you to take photos of your cars in various locations wasn't super anticipated before it appeared in GT4, it's definitely become a staple of the franchise since then. However, for the next feature on my list, the story is very different. The Course Maker has to be one of the most interesting features that Gran Turismo has ever attempted. First unveiled at Gamescom in August 2010, it was yet another element that built up the enormous hype surrounding Gran Turismo 5. Although Polyphony had experimented with a feature that allowed you to create your own tracks from scratch, the final product ended up being a bit more limited. Here, you're able to choose between 7 different themes, 5 on tarmac, 1 on gravel, and 1 on snow, where the game would generate a generic course for you. You're then able to change some basic parameters for each section of track, like the level of complexity and road width. For some, this was quite disappointing, as the feature was less of a course maker and more a course generator. And whilst I think that is a very fair criticism, I still think that a lot of fun can be had with it. Personally, I've spent many hours just messing around and seeing what sort of interesting tracks I can make. And I'm not alone in this, as proven by the numerous videos showcasing what became known as jump tracks. Simply, they were tracks generated by the course maker that included massive jumps, meaning that carnage was guaranteed. Look, I even managed to make one myself. Whilst this is clearly not what the feature was intended for, I'd be lying if I said that it didn't add to the enjoyment of it. On a more serious note, course maker tracks are able to be used in a few different ways in GT5. You can of course drive them in single player, either on your own or with AI opponents in arcade mode, and back when the servers were still up, you could share them with your friends and race them online. Tracks generated by the game itself even feature in GT mode. through the Gran Turismo karting experience and Gran Turismo Rally special events. The latter uses point-to-point courses which are not possible for the player to make, although the functionality still exists hidden within the game. This was also seen in some pre-release screenshots. But when it comes to things cut out from GT5's course maker, there's actually quite a lot to see. Not only were there additional track details like puddles of water and grass verges that are unseen in the final game, but also a couple of extra unique themes. Once again, these were seen in pre-release screenshots, one showing what looks like Toscana on gravel, very similar to the actual Toscana track in the final game, and another that depicts a sort of countryside road, featuring unique road markings. Sadly, in both cases, there's not enough data left in the game to load them, even through hacking. So, GT5's course maker is a novel feature, but still one that you can sink a good few hours into. Functionally, it works well, even if it is a bit frustrating at times, like when you want to edit the complexity of one section of track, and then it completely changes the entire course. That always annoys me. But Polyphony would get a chance to better it, as it soon became clear that they were planning to include a course maker in Gran Turismo 6 as well. And not just a course generator like GT5's, but one in which you could draw your own courses from scratch. The drawback to all of this is that it wouldn't be available in the game from launch. And so we waited. GT6 released in December 2013, but it wouldn't be until all the way into September 2015 that players could finally get their hands on the awkwardly named Track Path Editor. But there was a catch. The feature was not built into the game, but rather took the form of an app that was only available on iOS and Android tablets. Now, whilst people were soon able to bypass this by using Android emulators on PC, it still wasn't ideal. What also wasn't great was that it only featured 4 themes, all of which being on tarmac, and 3 in reality if you discount Eiffel Flat, that was simply intended as a basis for people to create track replicas. But on the positive side, the act of designing courses itself was pretty solid, with the use of a tablet touchscreen making the process feel very fluid. You were also able to place trackside objects like grandstands and trees where you wanted to, adding a nice touch of personality to your tracks. And once again, you were able to share your tracks with other players and race them online. So all in all, GT6's Track Path Editor represented a clear improvement from GT5's course maker. And yet, I feel like it managed to be more of a disappointment. The biggest thing it had counting against it was just how long it took them to put it into the game. If it had featured from the start of GT6, it would have been very impressive, but making players wait almost 2 full years really highlighted its shortcomings. Not just the lack of themes, but also the fact that elevation changes were still set in stone, with no way for players to influence them. Also the restrictions when it came to how tight you can make corners, and the strict limits on the overall length of your tracks. None of these are major issues, but when they spend so long designing this feature, you do expect it to be great and not just good. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention course maker hacking here. People have been able to mod the Track Path Editor and even use their own custom editors to create tracks with a much higher degree of freedom. If you played GT6 back in the day, you probably saw a few tracks that made use of this by having things like crossover sections, high banked turns, and of course, insane elevation changes. It's understandable that they never included any of this stuff in the vanilla version, but just like the jump tracks in GT5, there's no doubt that it makes the experience a whole lot more memorable. So, now to current day. Would I like the course maker to return to Gran Turismo? To put it simply, yes, I absolutely would. As someone who's been doodling track design since I was a small child, and still do even today, course makers in racing games are like a dream come true for me. And to see it appear in my favourite racing game franchise was kind of mind-blowing when it first happened. Even with the shortcomings of both GT5's and GT6's versions, I've still spent many hours enjoying them. But if I were to create my ideal version of a course maker to feature in GT7, it would definitely be integrated into the game. The major downside of GT6's track creator, other than being exclusive to tablets, is that now that the servers are offline, it no longer works. Not only can you not import your tracks into GT6, but you can't even drive on any of the ones you may have saved before the servers shut down. This is one major advantage that GT5's course maker has over GT6's, as it can still be freely used by anyone at any time. In terms of other improvements, I feel like having more agency over the elevation changes is very important when it comes to designing a track. I get why Polyphony didn't bother with this in GT5 and GT6, as it makes their job far simpler, but I feel like it really would be worth the extra effort for the freedom it offers players. Beyond that, I would of course want there to be a good selection of themes with decent variety, and a solid amount of customization when it comes to trackside scenery. Another key point is with how the course maker can be used in other parts of the game. I mentioned that in GT5, as well as driving your own creations in arcade mode and online lobbies, some pre-generated tracks are used in a couple of the special events. This is great because it integrates the course maker with the single player career, but can this be achieved in any other ways? When it comes to this, I think back to when I played Race Driver Grid on the Nintendo DS. This game featured a course maker, essentially the same one that was in Race Driver Create and Race, as they were made by the same developer. But what I thought was a really neat feature was how the game included these track design challenges, where you were tasked with creating a course within certain parameters. It had to be at least this long, it had to have these certain features, it had to work around the existing scenery. It was pretty in-depth. Now, if you were to take these track design challenges, you could integrate them directly into the single-player career. For example, there could be a 5-race custom championship where you have to design each of the 5 circuits to the different required standards. Not only would this test your track designing skills, but also your driving skills, as you would then have to race on each of them to try and win the event. As a template, I think that would be a pretty cool idea for a game mode. But whether or not you would enjoy something like that, I think we can all agree that there's definitely some unfinished business when it comes to course makers in Gran Turismo. If we will ever get a version of this feature that fully scratches that track designing itch, is something we'll just have to wait and see. Gran Turismo is a racing game. It's a game where you drive, usually in the context of a race. Just by saying that, some of you will probably already know where I'm going with this. We're taking a step back to Gran Turismo 4, because in mentioning the new features that GT4 brought in, like refueling, mission events, and of course, the photo modes, I left out maybe the most intriguing one of all. B-Spec is a game mode first seen in GT4 where you're tasked with managing an AI driver. The idea is simple. Rather than competing in the race yourself, an AI is tasked with driving your car. As a player, you can still influence the outcome in a few ways. First, there are 5 settings for how hard you want your AI driver to push. The higher the setting, the faster they'll go, but the more likely they are to make mistakes. You can also direct the driver to overtake, with varying degrees of success, and to pit in, although they will pit when they run out of tyres or fuel anyway. For the most part, this sounds pretty basic, but where it gets interesting is with B-Spec points. Every time the AI driver races, it'll earn B-Spec points based on what it does. I don't have time in this video to give a more detailed explanation on how it all works, but I'll leave a link to a page on the GT Wiki that breaks it down in the description. The upshot is that the AI driver will improve the more you use it, but the question is, will you want to use it? Well, it's quite obvious that watching an AI race is nowhere near as fun as doing it yourself, but there are some cases where it comes in handy. If you're a less experienced player, you might feel more confident in letting the AI take on some of the tougher races, assuming that it's been leveled up appropriately, or if you're simply unable to earn the necessary license to compete. On the other end of the spectrum, GT4 was the first game that introduced real-time endurance races. Instead of the mere 2 or so hours of the past games, GT4 has races that last up to 24 hours. This decision pairs almost perfectly with B-Spec, since you can let it drive whilst accelerating time at up to 3 times speed. In the international versions of the game, you can even swap between yourself and the AI driver at pit stops, simulating real endurance races where the car is shared between multiple drivers. It's pretty neat. For most players, this is the only time when they would really be inclined to use B-Spec. But for Gran Turismo 5, things would be a bit different. In GT5, B-Spec not only returned, but was revamped significantly. Now, instead of being merely an option that's available for most races, B-Spec has been spun off into its own career entirely. Your B-Spec driver is now given a name, a racing suit and helmet, and a personality. We'll get to that in a second. The B-Spec career is mostly identical to the A-Spec one, with the same events taking place on the same tracks. However, one key difference is that all of the races, with the exception of the endurances, have been made noticeably longer. They last twice, sometimes even 3 times as long as their A-Spec counterparts, and unlike GT4, you can't accelerate time, which is kind of weird. It seems like the decision was done to counteract accelerated time, but then you can't even do it, so what was the point in making the races so long? Anyway, once again, your driver has multiple stats that increase the more they race. The thing I find the most interesting here is the personality stats. The way this works is that cool drivers are less likely to make mistakes, but don't have the consistent speed of hot drivers. From my experience, you ideally want a driver that's somewhere in the middle, as if they're too hot, they tend to overdrive when around other cars, and if they're too cool, the moment they're not in a battle, their pace drops massively, so you have to instruct them to speed up. And unlike GT4, the instructions are only temporary, so you keep having to do it over and over again. This does make it more engaging, as you can't just leave your driver alone without giving them a massively overpowered car, but it's also pretty tedious. But hey, if you don't like your current driver, you can hire another. The more you progress in the B-Spec career, the more drivers you can hire, up to 6 in total. And you'll need to hire more drivers, as when you get to the endurance races, you'll need as many as 4 to compete. Personally, I feel like they should have combined the A-Spec and B-Spec careers at the endurance races, so that you can do what was possible in GT4 and have your B-Spec drivers as teammates to take over the car. I think that having to complete these races twice, once entirely by yourself, and again entirely with your B-Spec drivers, is kind of pointless. But at least the AI drivers could make you some easy cash through the remote racing feature, at least back when the servers were still up. Yes, with GT5 they definitely had some interesting ideas when it came to B-Spec, but it's hard to feel like they really nailed the execution. Whilst the B-Spec career is a solid idea, and the rewards certainly make it worthwhile, it still suffers from one major issue. It's boring. But boring though it may be, at least it isn't pointless. That honor is reserved for Gran Turismo 6. Yep, B-Spec returned once again in GT6, albeit well over a year after the game released. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because there's almost nothing to it. There's no B-Spec career, there's no skill levels, it's pretty much been reduced to its most basic form, merely an option. B-Spec is available in career mode races and functions pretty much the same way it did in the previous 2 games, with one big difference. Real-time controls are introduced. Essentially, instead of just telling your driver vaguely what to do, like to speed up or slow down, you can also take control of their car and force them to do it. You can make them accelerate, brake, slipstream, and even steer into another lane. You're actually given a surprising amount of control, which honestly makes you question what the point of it even is. These controls were added to counter the complaints of B-Spec drivers in past games being, well, stupid. Just braking in dumb places, not overtaking when they easily could, that sort of thing. And Polyphony's solution to this, rather than improving the AI in any way, was to allow you to just override them completely. Yeah, I honestly have no idea who they made this game mode for. Seriously, who would 1. Get use out of this, and 2. Enjoy using this? I have no clue. But that was the full rundown of B-Spec mode in each of the 3 games it's so far appeared in. So, should it and could it return to the series? I'll be honest, I've never been the biggest fan of B-Spec. It's a novel idea, but just not something that I gravitate towards. However, I still strongly believe that they can do some really interesting things with it. The only caveat is that I think if they added it to GT7 in its current state, it would serve about as much purpose as it did in GT6. But when you consider GT Sophie, Sony's machine learning AI, that's where things could get interesting. With Sophie, the intelligence would no longer be an issue, and it could open up many avenues of intriguing gameplay with how you direct it. In theory, they could start this relatively soon, by way of a special event that takes place on specific tracks using specific cars. Through these screenshots courtesy of Nenkai, we know that GT7 even has a hidden B-Spec debug menu, so maybe we're not far off. But an AI driver taking your place is one thing. Something that I've always wanted to be able to do is to race together with my B-Spec driver, and I'm honestly surprised that Gran Turismo has never tried this before. I mean, in real life motorsport you have teammates that race against you, so why not? You could even still give them basic instructions whilst you're driving. Of course, when I say this, many of you will likely be thinking about the Grid series, and not the DS game this time. It did something quite similar with being able to start your own team and hiring teammates. I mean, the back of GT5's box even has this line: become a racing driver or the boss of your own team. When it comes to GT5, let's just say that the marketing team really did some heavy lifting there. But who's to say that B-Spec can't live up to that billing one day? Going from racing independently to starting your own team would offer a nice form of progression, and open the game up to some interesting gameplay scenarios. Out of all of the features in this video, I feel like B-Spec is the one with the best chances of coming back in the near future. However, I'm not holding out much hope that it will return, or even meet our expectations if it does. I've been burned by doing that one too many times already. Photo Travel, Course Maker, and B-Spec are all features that were first introduced quite a few games into the series. But for our final one, I'm taking us all the way back to 1997. As I talked about earlier, when looking at the original Gran Turismo, there's no contest when comparing its feature list to the later games in the franchise. Beyond the main single-player campaign, there isn't a whole lot else to see or do. However, one of the game's landmark features was the tuning shop, which gave players the ability to upgrade their cars with various parts. At the time of GT1's release, this was a game changer, as no other racing game had ever tried to do something like it on such a large scale before. But if we have a look under the innocuous sounding Others tab, we can find something really interesting. Almost every single road car in this game has a tuning option known as a racing modification, essentially taking the standard production model and fitting a number of both visual and performance upgrades to make it appear as a true track weapon. Well, try to anyway. But given that the upgrade itself is pretty reasonably priced, it represents one of the easiest ways in this game to get yourself a race car. Effectively, what this option does is widen the performance scope of each car. This means that you can, for example, buy your starter car, then perform a racing modification at some point, and continue using it much further into the game if you want to. Not only that, but there's also the nice touch that a lot of these racing modifications also resemble real-life race cars. Of course, GT1 does have a handful of standalone race cars that don't need to be race modified. For example, the Mitsubishi GTO LM and Castrol Supra GT. Performance-wise, they are noticeably a bit stronger than the RMs, but given their increased rarity and exclusivity, I feel like they strike a solid balance between the two. Now, moving on to Gran Turismo 2, given the popularity of this feature, it was no surprise to see it return. But Polyphony would have their work cut out for them, with GT2 massively expanding the car roster to over 600 models. Of course, many of these were also road cars, meaning that the potential was there to create many more RMs. And whilst they would make a valiant attempt, with roughly 400 RMs appearing in the game, they wouldn't get round to every single car. Even still, there are plenty of new and interesting cars to enjoy, so I would hardly call this a disappointment. They come in all shapes and sizes, from original designs, to pretty clear homages, and even a few very deep cuts. However, there is one gripe I have with how racing modifications were handled in GT2. This being the requirement to have all 3 stages of weight reduction applied applied before you can do an RM. In GT1, this was not the case, with the RM itself even giving you an extra stage of weight reduction. Essentially, all this does is jack up the price to perform the upgrade, with the RM itself only adding downforce beyond the visual changes. This means that as an upgrade, it really isn't worth doing for a lot of the lower end cars, as you're spending a lot of money to gain very little performance. It's a bit of a shame, but all in all not a major issue because it is still very good value for many of the higher end cars, at least when compared to buying a standalone race car. GT2 includes not just race-inspired RMs, but also rally-inspired ones too. This makes sense, given that GT2 did introduce rally as a discipline. But one interesting quirk of this is how these cars are handled in arcade mode. There are 15 in total here, which are listed as standalone models rather than RMs, so that they can more easily be selected from the menus. And whilst they appear as identical to the RMs in Gran Turismo mode, they do have very slightly different specs. As the series moved onto the PlayStation 2 with Gran Turismo 3, racing modifications would sadly not return. The drastic increase in fidelity resulted in far fewer models, with GT3 only having 180 cars in total. As a result, once again creating RMs for the road cars was deemed as too much of a time sink, and so they were left out. However, this doesn't mean that GT3 doesn't have its own unique racing versions of existing cars. In fact, there's a handful of them, from the Honda Integra and Toyota Altezza to the Jaguar XJ220 and Pagani Zonda. The only difference is that they're all standalone race cars, and given that they represent a much smaller percentage of the total road cars in the game, I think the decision to not feature them as RMs instead makes sense. The same would be true in GT4, which once again added a number of its own original race cars, alongside those carried over from GT3, but still not enough to justify bringing back racing mods as a feature. But then we get to Gran Turismo 5. In its quest to be the racing game that does anything and everything, it was announced that racing modifications would be returning to the series after an 11-year hiatus. With the game featuring more than 1,000 car models, this gave the team a pretty steep task. So, how many cars were they able to give the RM treatment to? 500? No, that's not realistic. What about 200? No? Okay, how about just 100? I think that's reasonable. No. They made 17. Now look, I get it. Given how detailed the models were by this point, realistically it just wasn't possible to create many more to the same standards. However, that doesn't excuse their decision. Having so few cars being race modifiable completely misses the point of the feature and what made it so great in the PS1 games. At this point, you do have to wonder why they even brought it back. Was it just to cash in on nostalgia? Because as I sit here, being taunted by this icon in GT Auto, which is completely unusable for the 1,000 other cars in this game, I really don't see any other reason. For what it's worth, there were a few more racing mods planned that never saw the light of day. There are tech strings left over in GT5 for RM versions of the Suzuki Swift Sports, Honda NSX Type R, Lotus Evora, and even the Lexus LFA. Also, in October 2011, there was the Racing Car Pack DLC, which included 11 more GT original race cars, albeit as standalone models and not RMs. Anyway, as for the 17 cars themselves, I have to say that they're all very well done. They look great and there's decent variety. My only complaint would be that their liveries are quite basic. It would have been nice to see them get more creative, like in the PS1 days. Another positive is that they're decent value. As well as the visual mods and adjustable downforce, you also get a racing exhaust, fully customizable suspension and transmission, and an extra stage of weight reduction. Once again, you do get more for your money with the higher end cars, like the Corvettes, compared to the slower stuff. In fact, the Corvettes and the Camaro Z28 are very good budget options for some of the higher tier events in GT5. But moving on to GT6, although these cars would return, racing modifications would not. Polyphony took the quite wise decision, in my opinion, to just list each of them as separate vehicles that can be bought straight from the dealership. And since then, although original race cars continue to appear in the series, racing mods do not. So, should they come back? Well, as much as people loved this feature in the PS1 days, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say no. I don't think that it should return. Now, let me explain why I think this way. In Gran Turismo, the difference between what is a road car and what is a race car has always been a point of distinction. In the early days, it was fairly clear. Obviously, a road car is a production model, and a race car is one that was designed for the track. Even though you could upgrade a road car with racing parts, it still wouldn't look like a race car and wouldn't really drive like one either. This is where the racing modification came in to act as that final step, setting a clear boundary between what is a race car and what is a road car. The issue comes in when you try to apply this idea to current Gran Turismo. As the series has gone on, the level of detail when it comes to both visual customization and performance upgrades has increased tenfold, to the point where there can be virtually no distinction between a road car that has been heavily upgraded with racing parts and a pre-built race car. I have several cars in my GT7 garage which fit that description, and honestly, upgrading cars like this to create replicas or your own original designs is one of the best things about GT7. Take the Jaguar XJ220. Its visual upgrades even make it look extremely similar to the LM race car from the older games. And when you then combine this with the performance upgrades, you end up with a car that not only looks like, but drives like, and even sounds like a true GT race car. But despite these incredibly blurred lines, the game still insists there is a divide with how it categorizes the two. According to GT7, this XJ220 is as much of a road car as this one, and it always will be. As I've discussed, back in the day of limited upgrades, this distinction did matter. It prevented people from using overpowered race cars in events against road cars, but now it just comes across as yet another pointlessly restrictive element in Gran Turismo. When road cars can become pseudo-race cars, there's no longer any purpose. It just limits which vehicles can be used for what, based on an arbitrary standard that doesn't really mean anything in the game. So, this is why racing modifications no longer make sense in Gran Turismo. Personally, I advocate for a system with far more modularity, as in giving players the tools to turn their cars into whatever they want to through mixing and matching different parts. Look at the Ford Mustang GT. This car acts as a basis for 4 different versions: the Group 4 race car, the Group 3 race car, the Group 3 road car, and the Group B rally car. Now imagine if you could take all of the individual parts across all of those cars and use them for customization on the base road car. So you could take, say, the suspension and spotlights from the rally car, the wide body from the Group 3 car, and the splitter, diffuser, and rear wing from the Group 4 car to create something truly unique. And that's before we even consider unique parts that aren't available on any of the other pre-made Mustangs. Things don't need to be as rigidly defined as they often are with Gran Turismo. I'm sure that if Polyphony open their mind just a bit more, they'll find that a bit of flexibility goes a long way. And that just about does it. Those were 4 of Gran Turismo's most major features that have yet to return. Now it's time for me to do the classic YouTuber move and say, what do you think? Which of these features do you want to return, and how likely do you think that they will? Let me know in the comments. Of course, I only focused on the most prominent features, the ones that have appeared in multiple games and are fondly remembered by many people. But there are so many smaller, lesser known features that have been dropped by the series, to the point where I don't need to ask you guys to comment them, because I know you already have. But if you do, keep your eyes peeled, because I may just be talking about them in a future video. Until then, thanks for watching, and have a good one.